So I hope everyone enjoyed the lunch that was sponsored by Sapiens, and welcome to the Gallagher boardroom for where the last afternoon is going to be kicking off. I'm going to ask my awesome co-host, Gugu, to introduce the speaker for us for the next session.
Thank you, Herman. Once again, welcome to the Gallagher room. The rest of the afternoon is under the broad theme of professional matters. And for our first concurrent session under this theme, we're delighted to be hearing from Christoph Rath. Under the theme or the topic of his presentation is strengthening the core governance renewal for a thriving profession. Christoph, welcome. Join us on the stage. Please give him a round of applause.
There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I really am worried right now. Are you sure you're in the right session? You know this is going to be about governance, right? Really, I wouldn't take it personally if some of you got up and left right now, because I thought we might end up with like 6 or 7 people here, and if you look very carefully, I count at least like 8 people in the room at the moment. So, not sure where all of this interest in governance is coming from. But thank you all for attending. Really appreciate it. Nalen referred to the Rath. Is Nalen here right now? He says just been appointed president, is already slacking. He sometimes talked about the wrath of Rath in our council meetings, which sounds a little bit more like the title of a heavy metal band, which I might consider starting after all of this. But thank you very much for joining today. I've been on council for 4 years now, so my first council meeting was in November 2020, which means my last council meeting will be in November later this month. With mixed emotions, certainly some joy, Johan, but also some loss. It's been 4 years of agony, ecstasy, frustration, joy. It's been a wonderful journey, and I'll share some of the agony and the ecstasy with you here. When I started out in our induction packs, we got a beautiful slide from the then Chief Executive, Mike McDougall. It looked like this. Absolute piece of art that he shared with us to show what ASA looks like. You might notice some alignment and font issues if you look very, very carefully, but other than that, this is what the profession looked like when I joined. You will notice at the top there's like some trusts that sit adjacent to council. There's a board of examiners and an actuarial governance board. We refer to those as the independent boards that also sit adjacent to council, and then a bunch of committees and other boards. Sort of halfway during my tenure, the slide got upgraded, started looking a little bit better like this. Some small changes in this version. You'll also see an animal referred to as the disciplinary committee, with dotted lines going up both to council and to the actuarial governance board. You'll also see an ASA office, that's where Imran sits, which is, according to the slide, not accountable to anyone, which is probably a good place for Imran to occupy. And you'll notice a board of examiners at the top has like a dotted line going into an education board, but not into council. So again, some inconsistencies, not really sure how to relate one to the other. I think the best version or the best attempt at this, and I have to credit Imran for that, I think Imran finally realized that there is wisdom in actually getting graphic designers to support them. And in our integrated report last year, the picture started looking like this, a much more artistic, concentric circles. And this time the ASA office seems to be at least in some way accountable to council, Imran. And you'll notice, I'll refer to this one as I go through the talk that I want to go through right now. But I want to start with a question, which might seem like a really, really trivial question, is imagine there's something in the profession that you are unhappy about. Right, so just maybe the way exams are marked or or the fact that you didn't pass your last exam, maybe, or the way a disciplinary matter was handled or not handled, or the way Imran forgot to tuck in his shirt at the stage a little bit earlier. There's something that you're worried about. What do you do about it if there's something in the profession that you feel unhappy about? I should have actually done a poll, Roseanne. That would have been useful. I mean, I would anticipate you would tell me this is a really silly question, is it? But maybe you could write an email to the CEO. You could find a council member, tap them on the shoulder and say, I'm unhappy about it. You could write a letter to council. Maybe you would find someone who's making themselves available to serve on council who agrees with your views and vote for that person. Maybe you would make yourself available to serve on council. Those would seem to be the kind of intuitive answers as to where you would go if you're unhappy. But I guess what I need to share with you today is that the world is a lot more complicated than that, unfortunately. The subtitle to my talk, I kind of vacillated between making the subtitle, Who is in charge? Or Is anyone in charge? Because intuitively I think we want council to be in charge, and council is in many ways, but there's some more nuance and complexity to that I'll share with you. So right around the middle of last year, 2024, probably June or July, of course I can't remember exactly, but around that time, the council decided to conduct like a governance review. And the reason I'm sitting here today is to give you feedback on this governance review. And it was really because there are some themes that the council was worried about. So what really happened is Costa, I raised my hand because Costa asked if there's anyone who would like to have a body break in the middle of a meeting. And then after I raised my hand, I realized what he was actually asking is who's willing to chair the governance committee. And for that reason, I ended up chairing this committee. I regret that to this very day, Costa. Yeah, exactly. Body break that lasted 18 months. It was at times very painful. And Barry is sitting right in front of me. He's still upset that I couldn't invoice ASOF for this time, because it was an enormous amount of time that this consumed. But we at least have made a little bit of progress. So I don't know why this stock picture shows a calculator. We didn't use any calculators during this governance review, but I'll take you through what we've done. So we started out with by identifying a few work streams, and I'll deal with some in more detail than with others. But I really do want to thank Jasmine, who volunteered to chair our delegation of authority work stream, then Malusi, who volunteered to head up our terms of reference work stream, and Nalen looked at, we have two, like we said, we started referring to the two as the independent boards. They didn't really have a name before, but maybe now we can call them that. That's collectively the Actuarial Governance Board and the Board of Examiners, both of which stand independent from council. But Nalen looked at the first one, and Laura, who is an examiner herself, looked at the second one. And also on the committee, I don't know if Imran was just there or if he was a committee member, but he was always there, and thank you for that, Imran. And Louis Rousseau was also, he didn't head, it was very, very smart of Louis not to volunteer to head up one of the work streams. There he is right there, we're looking at you, Louis. But thanks for your contribution. Of course, Costa, I would point out in your speech you forgot to mention Louis. You know that? Okay. So thank you, Louis, for your time. On behalf of Costa. And also from the ASA office, Linda van Vuren was made available to assist us on the project management capacity. And I really want to thank all of these people. This is not pleasant work, it's thankless work, it's not fun. There are no decrement or mortality tables that you can turn to for fun while you do this work. So let me just kick off with the delegation of authority work stream. I'm going to take you through each of these very, very briefly. Now, I must emphasize, Jasmine did a lot of work with the ASA office. I'm summarizing a long report that she wrote here in a single slide, which doesn't do the work justice, but I think I'm just cognizant of time and some of the discussions that I would like to have. So actually what Jasmine did find in her work is just like from a from a financial decision-making perspective, there's a fair amount of structures and thresholds and delegation of authority frameworks in place, not so much from a non-financial perspective. Now, I must emphasize here why this is, and we should welcome these kinds of things. I was involved with ASA when I started out with helping out with some examinations. We didn't even have a chief executive officer, never mind an office of the executive. Sort of somewhere during my tenure as an examiner, Mike McDougall was appointed as our chief executive, and I think he was the only employee. Today, if we go to the Cape Town office, it's like 30 or I don't know, I can't count very well, 40 people running around in that office. It's become a huge machinery. And as with any business, as with any organization, you should expect the governance to follow the growth, not the other way around, right? So an organization will grow, it will become more complex, and then afterwards, one day, council will say, hang on, should we look carefully? So our main purpose of this review was to identify gaps. And if we identify gaps, it's not pointing fingers. We're celebrating every gap as like a symptom of growth and development. And as we do more things, we'll identify more gaps in time. So, there are certain non-financial decision-making delegations that are not clearly defined. We've also stumbled across, we have a few consultants in the society. I'm not sure what else to call them, but we have reimbursed positions in the society, one from a legal perspective. We have public interest actuary, we have Africa actuary, one or two more of those. But the governance around those have never been properly established. What does it mean if ASA pays you while you're serving on some structures? And we need some frameworks to deal with that. It's not problematic. It's just that we need a framework to deal with those things and think about tenure, etc. So that's also been identified. Of course, the matter of volunteers is also a major theme. We have one of the largest, was it Imran or Costo said earlier today, volunteers per member organizations. Masimba said to me earlier the week that, one of the peculiar things about the profession is the moment you qualify, people come to you and say, where are you going to contribute, which is wonderful. But it also poses governance constraints, right? Because we don't pay volunteers, and how do you hold people accountable if they're not being paid, etc.? And how do you deal with conflicts, etc., etc.? And then finally, there's some escalation processes, like Imran also identified the clear need. You can imagine if one day there's some potential PR disaster and Imran has 30 minutes to provide some opportunistic journalist with a commentary, how would those decisions be made? And what kind of delegation does he have? So, Jasmine, I don't want to reduce, or I have now done it, but I didn't want to, but to reduce a lot of work that Jasmine has done to a single slide, just to give you a sense of what this piece of work entailed. And then I can move on to the second work stream, which was Malusi, looking at the terms of reference. Now, this was quite interesting to do. We have many boards, we have many committees in ASA. Most of them have a terms of reference somewhere. Some is on a piece of scrap paper, some is in a Word document with a few bullets. Some are very well articulated and very well thought through. We found a few in Excel, for goodness sake. Really? So we identified, of course, the need to have something a little bit more consistent. And what Malusi assisted us with is to come up with maybe we could call it an MVT, or a minimum viable TOR, just to say, your practice area committee or your board or subcommittee. We found instances where subcommittees have proper terms of reference, and then they report into higher level committees which don't have terms of reference, which is also kind of peculiar. But again, this is a function of growth. And this is a function of the multiplicity of domains that we cover in our profession. So without touching on all of these in detail, again, you can see for yourself the kind of things that we came up with. And I think over the next year or two, the surviving remnants of this governance committee will knock on your doors and just try to make sure that we have something like this, and maybe also just a reasonable central repository of these tours because it turned out to be very hard to find them. They are out there in the universe, but you need to go and look for them. So let me move on to the more difficult parts of the conversation. And again, this is a difficulty that we should celebrate and that we should take comfort from. And this is where we have independent boards. And I'm going to start with a bit of a history lesson and maybe a bit of a philosophical reflection on why independence is very useful. So we're going to talk about two structures: the Actuarial Governance Board, which predominantly looks after disciplinary matters separate from council, and also the Board of Examiners, which is also independent from council. So I asked a generative AI to draw a picture, and it didn't. It's a horrible picture. It didn't come out very well, but I decided to stick with this because I thought maybe if I can start with a picture, maybe if ASA was a house or a building, and I would depict the visible and the pretty part of the structure as our education infrastructure. I think for the majority of stakeholders, certainly for the majority of our members, the student members, this is what they see ASA to be: tuition, accreditation, education, examination, the publishing of marks, the registration, the administration, the invigilation, many other words that rhyme with Asian, that sits in the domain of education. Now, Len has been chairing our education board for the past few years. An enormous amount of activity, visible activity, sits in the domain of education, which many people would perceive to be a very important part of what ASA does. But then I want to point you to the foundation of this building, and this is just my fairly primitive analogy to say that if education is the structure, then our disciplinary infrastructure would be the foundation of our profession. In more ways than one, I want to draw this analogy. I think our ability to run a fair, transparent disciplinary infrastructure, it's often invisible, it's often not noticed, it's below the surface. But if the foundation crumbles, then everything else will collapse. The foundation is also not particularly pleasant to cast or to look at, right? But it is a vital part of, I think, any professional body, not just ASA. I think is the ability to enforce standards and to act in those very, very rare instances where someone did something inappropriately or unprofessionally. So I want to leave this kind of picture with you. I think both of these are vital, but the foundation on which everything we do is built is our disciplinary structures. And then I want to ask another trivial question, but to me not so trivial at all. And yeah, I do think I would get different answers from different people. I have a very specific answer to this question that I will reveal in a second, but if I ask something as, and forgive the philosophical digression, but if I ask something as trivial as like, what does ASA do? What is its purpose? And based on my previous slide, you might say it's education. That's part of it. You might say this conference is part of it. Yeah, that's what ASA does. You might say that it gives like a warm and cozy place for actuaries to hang out and exchange ideas, and that's fair. That's also what ASA does. But we are this really, really weird thing, this ASA. We spoke to many lawyers, many more than I ordinarily speak to. And most of the lawyers who act in the professional domain were quite perplexed by this kind of animal, because actuaries perform statutory duties, but ASA is not a statutory body. ASA is a voluntary, largely like a private entity. And how do you marry these two? And given the statutory nature of what ASA does, Johan, who's sitting over there, will tell you that I like to talk about this at these professionalism courses. Now, I have an axe to grind with Johan because I have a solid track record for getting the highest score at the professionalism courses, when the students, of course, rate me. And of course, I score very highly. And at the very last professionalism score, I marked out 99% and Johan got 100%. I was incredibly disappointed. And I want a rematch, Johan, at the next professionalism course. But when I speak about professionalism, and some people might not agree with my take on it, but to me, the word professional, the word professionalism is indelibly intertwined with the public interest. I don't think you can call yourself a professional if you look at the etymology of the word professionalism, unless you are serving the public interest. And I can talk about this in more length, and some people may disagree with me. But if you ask me about the primary purpose of ASSA, I would say it's not the warm and cozy place of this convention. It is to make sure that actuaries serve the public interest. To me, that's at the core, the grassroots, primary, lowest level of what a professional organization like we do. And what do I mean with the public interest? Anne told me Dave is in bed and feeling sick today. David, through the CPC, the Code of Professional Conduct Review, tried very hard to define, what is the public interest. And I said to David at one stage, everyone knows what it is, but you can't define it. It's literally, it's like love. If I ask you what is love, you would understand what love is. Costa talked about love. You can't define it, you can't parameterize it, you can't reduce it to a mathematical definition, but you pretty damn well know what the public interest is. It's that little girl, I would say, at professionalism courses who her father passes away, but the life insurance pays out, and she can get a proper education. And maybe because some actuaries somewhere pushed back at some stage when there was a weakening of evaluation basis that had to be resisted, right? That's the public interest, isn't it? And that's what we serve. And I give some dramatic examples, I think intentionally so. But that's what being an actuary is all about. It's like, I work in the space of healthcare. And I think the reason I'm so passionate about this is because when you work in healthcare, these things are visceral. They're in your face. It's not a company that might collapse in 20 years' time because of a weak valuation basis. We've seen a medical scheme liquidate 2 or 3 years ago in South Africa. No, I'm not saying that actuaries should or shouldn't be held accountable for that, but what we saw after that liquidation, and a colleague of mine was present, where on a Saturday evening, a wife would bring her husband to a private hospital. He's just had a heart attack, and he was chucked out and told to go to some public hospital somewhere. We've literally seen hospitals. At the moment, there's another medical scheme under curatorship who's in financial difficulties, and we literally see hospitals throwing patients out because of that. When I talk about serving the public interest, that's the kind of thing that I mention. And I want to implore on you that it's palpable, it's visceral, it's important, and this is what actuaries do, and this is why what we do is important. So with all of that very dramatic context in mind, I'll start with the Board of Examiners, where Laura was kind enough to assist us there. There's a lot of work to be done in the Board of Examiners. I've been involved in exams, for more than 10 years. I was the principal examiner for F201 in probably the late noughties and the early 2010s. So if you failed a healthcare exam at that stage, you can come and blame me afterwards. And then I chaired the Board of Examiners for about 10 years after that. When I started out, so we're now kind of zooming into this part of the map. When I started out chairing the Board of Examiners, I took it over from Emil Stipp. And at that stage, things were very simple. The entire Board of Examiners consisted of the 5 F200 examiners. And ASSA only conducted those 5 fellowship exams. Mike's banking subject wasn't even a twinkle in ASSA's eye yet at that stage. But then we added the F100s, and there were some people looking over that. And then we added the N200s, the N100s, the A300s, the A200s. Today there's like a hodgepodge and a mishmash of boards, and not entirely clear who's accountable to whom and where everything sits together. We tried to bring some clarity to that. but COVID kind of derailed a lot of that. When Konrad Buckerberg was still in charge, we started drafting some frameworks. I think the pandemic just completely distracted us when online invigilation and all of the complexity associated with that became a thing. But I think Laura did some excellent work just to define what needs, again, looking at the gaps that need to be plugged. And again, I must emphasize, this is a function of growth. It's wonderful that ASA's examination capacity has grown to this degree. But now we must think carefully about, is there an oversight board of examiners? Is it a hierarchical structure? Is it a flat structure? And there are some proposals on the table as to what it could involve. The other part is like this independence at the top of the slide. The Board of Examiners is independent. We've always treated it as independent. And then we looked in the Constitution to find the independence, and guess what? It's not there. There's nowhere is it defined as the independent entity that it is. So maybe a constitutional change would be required if we want to retain this independence. And we think the independence is a good idea, just like with the AGB, as I'll come to. Why do I talk about independence? I guess what I want to talk about is the function of a Board of Examiners is to maintain standards and to make those difficult decisions about who will pass and who will fail. Now, it hasn't happened, but you can conceive of a situation where the council might feel it wants to instruct the Board of Examiners that standards should be higher or that standards should be lower, and that the Board of Examiners does not agree that you can call someone an actuary when they meet that particular standard. So what should happen then? This is what I mean when I talk about independence, and by established practice, this is the way we've treated it in the past, is that the Board of Examiners would report into the Education Board, but it's a consultative kind of reporting for information, and similar with the Council. So the independence hasn't been properly defined other than through established practice. And then, of course, when it comes to dispute resolution, if, and hopefully never, but if there's a difference of opinion, we need a mechanism to deal with that, which is also what we considered. Right, so then let me move on to the more dramatic, murky storm. You can see the ocean and the clouds here in our disciplinary structures. And there's a couple of things I want to say about disciplinary structures. It will always be an emotive topic. It will always be an unpleasant topic. It will always be a controversial topic. I don't think you can digest the disciplinary stuff in any profession. As important and as foundational as it is, you'll never have these conversations without a little bit of unpleasantness and awkwardness in the room, and we should acknowledge that, right? And I think it's Arthur who always referred to, these are the people in the first lines, like in the trench lines, when he talks to the disciplinary committee. It's extremely unpleasant work to be involved in the disciplinary structures, but it's also extremely important work. So I want to give a little bit of context to say, I think this weird space that we occupy in ASA, like self-regulation, yet being of a statutory nature, but not being a statutory body, I think it's an enormous privilege that we enjoy. That we get to some degree, we can write our own rules, right? We can decide what it means to have a practicing certificate. And it's a very, very fragile line where we could breach over if regulators lose faith in our ability to self-regulate, that overnight we could lose it. And it's not hard to imagine how we could lose it, right? So again, I work in healthcare. I'll give a very simple example. A few years ago, the Council for Medical Schemes started accrediting chartered accountants. It was not interested in what IRBA or SAICA says. It said, as the regulator, individual chartered accountants are now being accredited by the Council for Medical Schemes. And if you're a CA, regardless of your experience, if you're not accredited by the regulator, you can't sign financial management, you can't sign audited financials. Now that might sound relatively benign, maybe it is. I know of at least one instance though where a chartered accountant did express a view that differed from that of the council. And for good or for bad reasons, I'm not interested in the merits, but I understand that CA did not see the accreditation renewed in the next year. Right? That would mean that the independence of that independence professional competency has been compromised, and probably because of a regulator who rightly or wrongly lost faith in that profession. So it is absolutely vital, it's not child's play, it's not trivial, that regulators and members and the public and government see that the self-regulation of ASA is done properly. We could lose it in an eye blink. And I think it's from that perspective that I want to emphasize, why we are so passionate about this domain. If people don't think that we do a good job, we'll lose it. And it is very easy to lose it. For now, all regulators, as far as I can tell, are very happy to rely on our own practicing certificate system, and that's great. It's amazing. Because, we, I guess, believe that we would be better at coming up with appropriate PC criteria than an external party like a government. I'm exceptionally fond of this quote by Lord Hewitt, former Chief Justice of the UK, who said, "Justice must not only be done, justice must also be seen to be done." And those are two very, very different things. Now, why do we have an independent actuarial governance board? I know if you ever go to a professionalism course and you listen to Mickey, I'm stealing some of his thunder here. And the older people in the room would be quite familiar with the Morris Review. I'm sorry if I just called some of you old. But in the late 90s, early noughties, in the UK, one of the oldest life insurers collapsed, Equitable Life. Urban legend has it, maybe the audience can help me, but urban legend has it that Equitable Life come from the 1700s and literally invented the word actuary. Is that true? That's what I read. So I'm sticking to that. I won't let the truth stand in the way of the good story. So the company who invented the word actuary, did you nod your head, Mickey? Is that correct? The company who invented the word actuary in the 1700s collapsed, at least in part due to actuarial misconduct, right? And this happened in the UK. The IFOA acted, and politicians and consumers in the UK largely felt that the manner in which the IFO acted wasn't sufficient. There's always, and with every professional body I see, I deal a lot with doctors, so we see how other professional bodies in that domain act. There's always a lingering perception, an accusation, almost a biased expectation that professional bodies are more interested in protecting their own than acting in like a visible and a decisive manner. And that was certainly the impression that was left behind after the IFO in the UK investigated this. And this went, this became a political thing in the UK. Lord Penrose did a review. He then commissioned Sir Derek Morris to do a review of about 170 pages. And all of this history is relevant to say to you that when Morris came out with his review, and this happened in the UK, of course, but he was scathing in his criticism and said, you can't keep this independence. Now, I just said self-regulation. He said you can't keep the self-regulation. I just said self-regulation is one of our biggest assets, but Derek Morris said that self-regulation is inadequate. He said that you must have independent oversight, as you'll see on the slides. He established something similar to what we in South Africa today call the AGB, saying, that the disciplinary infrastructure of a profession must be overseen by not only actuaries, maybe by a majority of non-actuaries, so that there can be credibility in the system, that people looking from the outside can find it credible. He also was quite scathing in his criticism, by the way, of the idea that the actuarial profession in the UK only acted once someone complained. He said you shouldn't wait for a complaint to be registered. You should act proactively if there's potential misconduct in your profession and should do it quickly. And maybe there's some food for thought for us to think about there as well. He talked about the public interest, so, my passion, and he talked about public accountability. And that might involve stuff like, publishing names of people that may have been found guilty of misconduct. So this is where our structure has its genesis. We heard Costa mentioned the erstwhile Garth Griffin earlier. As part of our review, we also interviewed Janina Slovsky, and we also interviewed Adrian Basker, both past presidents who presided over the establishment of the AGB in its original form. It was a little bit different originally than it is now. But what we have today is really, if I can explain to you, this very complex, and I think, forgive the lecture, but I think many of our members are not familiar with these structures. So to make you familiar with how these things work, we have the ASA Council, on which I served. We have a disciplinary committee, which you can think of as the day-to-day exco, almost the executive of the disciplinary structures. But then we have the oversight over the disciplinary committee, and by design, it's not council. It's the actuarial governance board. And the actuarial governance board, some of them are here today. Mickey Lowther is an actuary, is the chair of the actuarial governance board. But then the other members in the board is a lawyer and an advocate and a chartered accountant. I should not make a joke and say a lawyer and a chartered accountant walked into a bar and discussed the future of the actuarial profession. No, it's by design. That's exactly how we wanted it when we started out, is to say a majority of non-actuaries. And also you do need much more legal expertise than any actuary could ever dream to have when you deal with these kinds of structures. So, looking at, and we also had an independent legal experts review and give us some advice during this review. I'll come to that later. But they summarized it very neatly. If you want to understand what all of these entities do, the AGB designs and oversees. The AGB designs the disciplinary process and oversees that it happens in the correct way. The disciplinary committee does it on a day-to-day basis. You could think of it as the executive, the day-to-day. They screen, they investigate, they charge, they dismiss, they propose sanctions, they direct cases to mediation. And the council's role, if you read the constitution, is to implement and to enforce. Now, what does that mean? Well, in practical reality, the council approve appointments to these committees, and also when a sanction comes to the fore where guilt is admitted, the council would approve that sanction, and the council also establish tribunals. And then if there's an outcome, in the case of a tribunal, if there's an outcome, the council would publish. A council can't change or interfere in a tribunal decision. Now, all of this complexity may be a lot more complicated than you signed up for when you thought you were walking into this room, but there are good reasons for that, like I tried to explain with the Morris review. And we are dealing with a really emotive, I think, Mickey, I think it was in this very room 2 years ago that Jonathan and Mickey sat here and surveyed our members. And to be honest, my recollection is that year, both in the town hall discussion and in this room, there were some very emotive comments coming from the floor, and understandably so. And I think we should accept that as normal, is what I want to propose today. We should expect some friction. We are dealing with disciplinary cases. We are dealing with lawyers, for heaven's sake, people who fight for a living. There should be a healthy friction, at least is the way that I look at this. But I want to share a little bit more and then give you the conclusion and leave some time for questions. Confidence is paramount to the disciplinary domain, and that makes it very hard to ventilate these things in public. And I'm sure every one of you would appreciate that if there was a complaint, maybe an opportunistic complaint levied against you personally, you wouldn't want the existence of the complaint or your name to be broadcasted, at least not unless there's a guilty finding against you. If the complaint is dismissed, and every one of you should enjoy that protection as a member, if the complaint was dismissed, no one should ever know that it existed. And that's why disciplinary cases are dealt with in the utmost of confidence. Even counsel, and I can vouch for that after having sat there for 4 years, we have no idea which complaints are being processed. If you see a disciplinary committee report to council, it reads like a case against an actuary related to X and Y, and we are currently investigating. And that's like the sum total of what council gets to see. All of the more complicated and legal and intrinsic stuff sits with the disciplinary committee overseen by the actuarial governance board. And so this is the independence that I talk about. Now, the independence of the actuarial governance board comes with some pros and some cons, right? And I think it's worthwhile to articulate those. There's no reason to beat around the bush. The independence brings credibility to the system. The fact that we have and that we subscribe voluntarily to independent oversight should be welcomed. The independence allows someone like the AGB to be more dispassionate, more objective, more removed from everything, and look at it more clearly without being bogged down in the emotive details of a case. That's what we would expect. At the same time, I want to propose that, of course, with the dispassionate being removed from everything, it also takes away what Nassim Taleb would call the skin in the game. I think if I asked any of you to preside over a disciplinary case in the SAICA domain, you would probably also look from a little bit further removed. But if you preside over something where you feel personally involved and where you feel the public interest is at stake and the reputation of the profession is at stake, you might act in a different way than if you were dispassionate about it, as the AGP is deliberately structured to be. There's some interesting artifacts that we've observed over council over the past few years, and I think, when Morris wrote the review and suggested independence, his clear anticipation when he recommended that was that the disciplinary outcomes in the institute faculty domain would become more public and perhaps more severe. Now, we've done a survey amongst council members, and I think perhaps ironically and perhaps unexpected or not expected, the council is unanimous today in its view that it feels, with the limited information at its disposal, that there should have been more publications and public sanctions, and there should have been harsher sanctions over the past 5 years. Now, this is a council view, and it's maybe a view that we would expect an actuary to hold if you are closer to the profession and if you are closer to the public interest. It is interesting to note it because the expectation from Morris was the polar opposite, right? The expectation was that independence would result in outcomes that are perhaps lighter, that independence would result in harsher outcomes, whereas today it would appear that the opposite has occurred. But I also can't suggest that council is right in this assessment. Council doesn't have all of the information that it needs to make these kinds of assessments. We're just talking about a perception. And the perception is important because my concern is, of course, that if our own council holds such a perception, there's a very high probability that a regulator might also hold a similar perception. And if a regulator holds that kind of perception, we risk losing our self-regulation, as I indicated earlier. And so that is why these conversations are extremely important. I think what typically happens, if I can characterize the meeting of minds, and I'm going to try something which is impossible to explain the difference between a lawyer and an actuary. But, why an actuary might become very animated by the public interest, as I hope all of you should, and what actuaries should be supporting as our primal objective, as I mentioned. You will find, and if you think about it quite understandably so, that the lawyers become quite animated by the potential risk and potential liability of being challenged in the High Court at some stage down the line. And, any disciplinary case can be taken on review in the High Court. There could be liabilities, there could be fines, there could be any kinds of things coming out of that. And you would understand that that would animate the thinking of a lawyer. I think last year at the conference, Roseanne and Louis and Emile presented. Emile made the point at that conference that we should stick to our guns. And if we feel about something, we should be willing to adopt a bit of risk and to adopt a bit of cost to support, let's say, something in pursuit of the public interest, even if there's risk. And I would, as an actuary, agree with Emile until you ask Jonathan over here or Linda Lani, and they'll say to you, but dude, you have no idea what the risk and the cost is. And the cost is not just financial. Now, I'm not suggesting I'm right. I'm not suggesting Jonathan is right, so to speak. I'm suggesting both are right and both are wrong, and these are good debates to have. And to the credit of the AGB has been exceedingly approachable and engaging, and conversations between council and the AGB is happening a lot more especially now, than it's ever happened before. I think we must also recognise, just like I said, growth. Our disciplinary infrastructure in council has been stress tested over the past 5 years more than anyone who authored the original infrastructure could have ever anticipated. And you are going to find that weaknesses emerge. And what we're hoping to do through the present process is to look at what we can learn from what happened over the past 5 or 6 years and see where those weaknesses are and how they can be improved. And I really want to thank Mickey and the AGB for entertaining those kinds of discussions without compromising their independence. Some of the themes that we've touched on during the review, I've been very frustrated as a council member. I've often characterised council's position as one of paralysis. Council cannot and shouldn't be involved in any disciplinary cases, presumably so that it could be free to opine in adjacent areas that is not to do with the disciplinary domain. But we found as council members that we were often instructed by the ASO office that we can't intervene in matters proximate to disciplinary matters. Like, it's the first time in my life that I was conflicted and unconflicted at the same time, and I couldn't move forwards, backwards, or sideways as a result of that. Too conflicted to act, which is true, too uninvolved to intervene, even if it's a matter unrelated but proximate to an ongoing disciplinary matter. We were also, council felt a bit uncomfortable with the fact it was broadcast, I think, presented upon at the conference last year, and I think it's common knowledge that at some stage the AGB made changes to the disciplinary procedure. It introduced those changes effective, applicable to ongoing cases, and those changes also opened up possibilities that didn't exist before, like terminating a case or sending a case to mediation. I must emphasise that the AGB acted completely within its powers. They didn't do anything that they're not entitled to do, and they occupy an independent position, and in their judgment, in their independent judgment, this was the right thing to do. Council probably did not agree completely. It's some very robust discussions, and I think I want to give you the comfort that those disagreements happen, and they should happen, and they will continue to happen. If we want an independent disciplinary oversight, we should welcome those as signs and symptoms of a healthy and a working process. And a little bit of clashing of minds and butting of heads is really healthy in my books. And again, here too, we realized that there could be a bit more of a mature or a sophisticated dispute resolution infrastructure. Our constitution at the moment is wholly inadequate here. There is a clause, believe it or not, that contemplates council going into formal arbitration against the AGB. It's like a nuclear option that we would never, ever invoke. So we've identified that too as something that requires attention. We have proposed maybe a bit more of a sophisticated dispute resolution mechanism. And again, I want to say that these robust discussions keep on happening. We should view these as a healthy consequence of independence, and I don't want to discount the frustration that I personally also have struggled to process over the past 4 years, and I'm sure many other people in the room. But we decided to adopt this independent infrastructure, and if this is the way we do things, then this is the way we're going to do things. You know, unless we decide otherwise at some point in the future, which I don't think is in the cards right now. And I just want to say, throughout all of these debates and altercations and friction, the guiding star, that is the public interest, is what should remain paramount in my books. We did appoint a team of legal experts, so as if we didn't deal with enough lawyers yet, we got even more on board, and just provide them, like from a council perspective, with like a history of everything that we've seen. But we've also asked them to be creative and just say, if there were a blank canvas, what changes could you recommend to the way we do things at ASA? One of the experts we got in is someone who specialises in professional disciplinary matters and does a lot of work in SAICA, so that's useful expertise to draw on. And what we got back is some proposed changes to the disciplinary procedure, which Mickey and the AGB has already started looking at and review. Of course, they're free to do with it as they please, but they've undertaken to review it, and I'm grateful for that. So David would be, I'm glad for David's sake that he's in bed today, because there are also some changes that they propose to the Code of Professional Conduct, as if he doesn't have enough on his plate yet, but I'll break the news gently. Anne. And maybe that's input that work stream can also just consider, but we've done the work. And then finally, there are some changes that they proposed to the Constitution, which is no small feat. Of course, to ventilate changes to the Constitution, we're probably looking, and that's for Nalen, over the next year, maybe 2 years of ventilating these on sessionals until some stage where we think membership might be ready to vote on that. You don't just change the Constitution overnight for fun, but we do believe some constitutional changes would strengthen the entire system. So those things have been done. Right, and then finally, how should we deal with dispute resolution? Well, there's a couple of ways, and there's more to say here, and some of this is perhaps just par for the course, but we want to formalize it just to say, we start with the good faith engagement, which I can safely say does already exist. There are differences of opinion, but there isn't animosity. There are healthy debates and robust debates, but people leave as friends and come as friends. But there's good faith engagement to start with. If that fails to yield results, the proposal is to escalate to some kind of a facilitated discussion, failing which one can go to mediation, and then hopefully never some nuclear option at the end of getting a senior counsel to pronounce if it's really impossible to get to some kind of a conclusion. But I think we need something formal just in case at some point in the future there's significant disagreement. Yeah, and that's my last slide. So I'm going to go back to my guiding star, which I believe is the public interest, and some of you might believe different. I think, if we keep this guiding star in mind, if we think about the societal impact that actuaries and in particular professional actuaries have, the impact that we have in healthcare, the impact that we have in retirement, the impact that we have in life insurance, in banking, I think a lot of what we do as professionals and a lot that we want to govern as a society is to make sure that our own members uphold the public interest and that society at large can rely on us to feel secure, that they can trust these financial institutions to deliver on their promises. So I'll leave it there, and I think we have 10 minutes for questions, but they're going to tell me it's 7. But let's see if it's 10. Thank you. Ten or 7, what is it? No. This is where I want to declare a dispute.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for your talk. I'm really glad to see the position that ASA is and ASA Council. I mean, I served on ASA Council about 11 years ago, and it was at a time when it wasn't as joyous, or a lot of people wanted to volunteer. It was a tough job. Anyone that took up the job, knew they had a tough task. And I don't want to labor the point, but you talked about the past and building the ASA brand and getting exams on there. But I think for me, the one thing that's still lingering is something that I've observed at work where it seems like it's quite difficult for students to get into ASA as a member. We still have that strict requirements, and it sort of leads to either somebody doing a university degree with math, stats, or XI in it. The sad part is that we're seeing black females that have accounting degrees that want to do actuarial studies, but they don't meet any of those requirements, but they still got a university degree. They're born in South Africa, black female, exactly the transformation targets. And they choose to go to the IFOA because they can't get into ESSA because the requirement is so strict. So I understand the history and, protecting the profession and, ensuring we're responsible in the public interest. But maybe it's time to open that discussion up. Why not give more people the opportunity to write an exam? It's a small cost, but it's a major difference. And the lines are sort of, we talk about transformation, we just want access, and people that don't know a CA or haven't, done a degree. I think I'm laboring the point, but basically they don't have the access, and we're not acting in the public interest to give them that opportunity, write the exam. Maybe you're still working in accounting, but you pass 2 or 3 exams and you can convince somebody that you can be a junior analyst in an insurance company or wherever. So we're not actually allowing opportunities and growth, because we still have that old mindset that we're an exclusive club. You need to do it through a university. You need to do what we say you need to do, instead of opening things up, saying, listen, we've got exams right to the bottom now. You can essentially come out of matric and technically start board exam 1 and actually, become fellow actuary, which is still very valued, in South Africa. So, to summarize, at the end of the day, I just want to sort of say, isn't it time we focus on that, entrance requirement as a very urgent sort of agenda, now that we've fixed all the, TORs, and I love that, what you're saying is amazing, from where ESSA started in terms of its journey. So that's the question I leave to you. Is it something that I can get added to the agenda to the next council, set of council that's in, or the governance board, if it sits still with the governance board, to really look into that? Thanks.
I'm worried about time, so I got the question, and maybe we can just get a few, and then if it's okay with the facilitators, then I'll try to take them jointly.
No, thank you so much, Christian. I think this was absolutely amazing. If they talk about protecting the country, this is actually one of the things that can protect the country. And in addition, I would not agree with the suggestion. I think the way ASA does it, the way strict it is, that's how it should be maintained. That, if you check the slide that Christian presented on self-regulation, ASA being a voluntary organization as opposed to a statutory organization, if you have a situation like that where people without actual science degrees flood the organization, it can create a serious problem if you look at it against that slide. So for me, I would not be pro that suggestion.
I like that we're presiding over a debate here. Just to help me and the facilitators, can I just get a sense of how many questions, just really high? I see a pink shirt. Is it pink or is it salmon? And another hand there and a hand at the back. And I believe those are 3. And I'm not even looking at that way because they're going to tell me we don't have so much time, but we're doing it anyway. So let's see.
Hi, Christoph. It's Simon Lowe. Thanks very much for your work. I really support it. It's great. I support the independence of the AGB. You posed a very vexing question separate to that, and I just want to know your personal answer. Who is in charge?
Thanks, it's a good question. That's my answer. I'll respond in more detail just now.
Thanks very much for all the hard work done. Thanks to Costa for calling for that toilet break 18 months ago. Seems like it was a good idea. Just a question about the independence of the education board. So a lot of important issues regarding exams. Are exams too hard? Are they too easy? Is there a disconnect between the syllabus and actual working? Why would council not be involved in those questions? If council represents members, then does that mean that members, we are not involved in that as well? So I think it would be, I don't know about your answer, but I think it would be nice to open it to members to find out should that independence still be there. Thank you.
And I do think there was a last hand in the corner there.
No, you're not getting out so easily. Yeah. Christoph, I've got a challenge understanding why the council will be so invested in trying to convince the AGB on what they should do if independence is a key aspect of their role. I've got difficulty with that. I understand maybe you've done a survey, you've had a lot of feedback from members that are indicating that things need to be done in a certain way, or maybe not. I just think that once you have canvassed a view with them, you've told them what the members feel, you leave it there. There should be no need for you to challenge what the AGB is saying. So I want to understand what is it that is so important and from what's coming from the members, that you would feel that even after you've had a discussion with AGB, you would have to sort of continue with that until you get something that maybe you feel you're satisfied with?
All right, so shall I try? How much time do I have?
If you can be brief, but there's a lot of questions, and we encourage you to also reach out to the speaker afterwards through the people version of the app. But unfortunately, we don't have time for any more at this stage. But there's a minute or two you can take, Christoph.
I should deal with the questions in -3 minutes. So I'll deal with it briefly. I think first, in terms of the mini debate that just played out here, which I'm grateful for. Look, Malusi, in his part of the review, also identified the premise or the primacy of the importance of transformation. Like, where does it actually sit? It does sit somewhere, but he suggested in our structures that we can make it more explicit. I would like to invite you, though, to perhaps confront your chief executive officer over there. And I think all I want to say is perhaps much more is being done to open pathways. A lot is being done to invest in this by employers and by the society alike, and remove obstacles for people who show talent. And maybe you'll be pleasantly surprised if you heard it, but the balancing of enabling us to continue to uphold the public interest is important. Simon, thanks for the question. The answer is that council is in charge. But, Cyril Ramaphosa is the president of South Africa. He appoints a constitutional court judge. After that, he cannot interfere with the constitutional court judge, as Zuma realized when Zondo started doing all kinds of interesting things, right? I think that's paramount to these kinds of structures. But that doesn't mean that the president of South Africa is not Cyril Ramaphosa. And that touches on Lusani's question. I disagree with Lusani. I strongly disagree with Lusani, and it's okay that we disagree on that. I think it can happen that if council feels that the public interest is compromised, if council feels that our ability to self-regulate is in danger, or if I can extend on my Ramaphosa example, Busisiwe Mkhwebane was impeached. This is a Chapter 9 institution, so it did happen that there was a disagreement between the government and an independent body. And we're not there by a long way in the society. But what I want to suggest is that where areas of disagreement arise, they must be ventilated. And even if it's just in the form of consulting. And I want to thank Mickey again for his indulgence. I think the AGB has been more than open to ask council to come and share their views, because those are healthy conversations to have had. And I think, Lusani, the more minds, the better. I think the more perspectives, the better. If council disagrees with the decision that has been made, I do not subscribe to the view that council should just remain quiet about that. Thanks. I see frantic gesturing, but I guess I know what this guy's going to say. So.
Sorry, we've run out of time, people. So if you're more than welcome to reach out to the speaker through the app. But Christoph, just thank you very much. I think you made jokes about this being governance, but as you can see, after lunch on the second day, you almost have a full room and people with too many questions. So thank you very much.
Some of them still regret it.
No.
Thanks.
You guys do fantastic work, and I think all current and future actuaries can be grateful, and you're really strengthening the profession and making sure we will always be looking after the public interest. So thank you very much for that, and we've got a hand of applause.